The year 1315. The fields of Europe, which had produced golden harvests for 200 years straight, suddenly turned into graveyards for starving people. The rain would not stop. Month after month, year after year, water poured from the sky, and the earth stopped giving grain. People ate the seed grain they had saved for next year's planting. Mothers abandoned their own children. In some places, people ate the bodies of relatives who had already died. This is not some legend. This was the Great Famine, and it was only the beginning of a disaster that would reshape its map, its mindset, its governments, and even the bloodline of its people for the next 500 years. By the end of this video, you will understand how a slow, silent climate shift caused the biggest civilizational collapse since the fall of Rome. You will see how it sparked witch hunts across an entire continent. You will see how it made the Black Death far more deadly than it should have been. And you will see how, out of all that destruction, new methods emerged that became the foundation of the modern world we live in today. If you think climate change is only a modern issue, this video is going to change your mind. Let's begin. To understand the Little Ice Age, picture what came before it. This was not a storm that arrived overnight. It was a slow but powerful shift that stretched from around 1300 all the way to 1850. Before this, from roughly 900 to 1300, Europe lived through what scientists call the medieval warm period. The climate was so pleasant that Vikings farmed in Greenland, grapevines grew in England, and Europe's population tripled. People believed this prosperity would last forever. Then something happened that scientists still argue about today. Some point to a drop in solar activity, a period called the Maunder Minimum, when sunspots nearly vanished. Others blame massive volcanic eruptions that filled the atmosphere with ash, blocking sunlight from the ground. And some research points to shifting ocean currents in the North Atlantic. The truth is likely all three, working together, a perfect storm that dropped temperatures worldwide. Europe took the worst of it. Now, this next number matters more than it sounds. We are talking about an average drop of just 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. If someone told you today the temperature had dropped 2 degrees, you probably wouldn't notice. But agriculture runs on tight margins. 2 degrees meant shorter growing seasons, failed harvests, and mass die-offs of livestock. A small shift sustained for decades is enough to shake the foundations of a civilization. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was the first major blow of this new cold era. Constant rain rotted crops in the ground. Animals starved for lack of feed. Historians estimate 10 to 15% of Europe's population died within those 2 or 3 years. This was not just death by hunger. It was a complete breakdown of society. Crime rose. People abandoned their land for the cities, and the ones who survived came out of it with bodies so weakened they had almost nothing left to fight off disease. This is exactly where the chain reaction begins. When the Black Death arrived in 1347 and wiped out roughly half of Europe's population, it hit so hard precisely because people were already broken. Their immune systems had been battered by years of famine. Malnutrition had left bodies too weak to resist. In other words, the climate shift didn't just bring death on its own. It cleared the road for a far greater death to follow. Now picture an ordinary farmer of that time. Call him Johann, living in a small village in Central Europe. His grandfather knew the prosperity of the medieval warm period. Johann's life looks nothing like it. Winters are longer. Summers are shorter. Crops that once ripened in 3 months now take longer. and if the rain arrives even a little early or late, the whole harvest is lost. Every year, Johann tries to guess what's coming. But there is no forecasting, nothing to tell him whether this is one bad year or something permanent. All he knows is that God must be angry, or some dark force is working against his land. That exact fear fed a new wave of horror, the witch hunts. When people cannot explain why their crops keep failing, why their animals keep dying, why their children keep falling sick, they look for someone to blame. The largest waves of witch trials in Europe, during the years when the weather was at its most extreme, especially between 1560 and 1630, the coldest stretch of the Little Ice Age. People believed witches could summon storms and destroy harvests. Thousands, mostly women, were executed over this belief. A shift that was purely about weather turned directly into human cruelty, because people needed someone to blame for their suffering. But inside this destruction, something remarkable also happened: adaptation. When old methods failed, people built new ones. In the Netherlands, where land already fought a constant battle with water, engineers expanded their systems of dikes and canals, because the cold was freezing rivers and rewriting flood patterns. This is exactly why the Netherlands still runs one of the best water management systems on Earth. Its roots trace back to the pressure of the Little Ice Age. Farming itself went through a quiet revolution. When wheat kept failing in the cold, farmers turned to buckwheat and rye, both far hardier crops. But the single biggest change was the potato. When it arrived from South America, people were suspicious. Some even thought it was poisonous, even the work of the devil. But as the cold deepened, farmers realized the potato produced more food on less land, and it grew where wheat couldn't survive at all. Within a few centuries, the potato became a lifeline across much of Europe, especially Ireland. These changes went far beyond food. When farming alone could no longer support families, people abandoned their land for the cities in search of work. This is exactly why so many European cities grew rapidly during this period. Urbanization on this scale simply doesn't happen this fast without a crisis forcing it. Even home changed. When winters turned brutal enough to make traditional houses dangerous, people built better ones. Chimneys, once a luxury of the wealthy, started appearing in ordinary homes so smoke could escape while heat stayed trapped inside. Insulation proved. Clothing changed too. Wool use rose, and layering, several thin layers instead of one thick one, became common, because people learned that layers trap more heat than bulk ever could. Fishing, as well. As the North Atlantic grew harsher, fishermen were forced to build stronger boats that could survive rough seas. Communities in Norway and Iceland refined their techniques so well, they remain among the best cold water fishing methods in the world today. Now here's a story you may never have heard: the Vikings of Greenland. During the medieval warm period, Norse settlers had built farms in Greenland, keeping cows and sheep in classic European style. These settlements lasted for centuries. But as the Little Ice Age set in, Greenland's climate turned too harsh for European-style farming. Crops failed, livestock died, and the surrounding seas froze so thick that ships from Europe could no longer reach them. Here's the twist. At the very same time, in the very same place, the Inuit people were surviving just fine, because their entire way of life, built around fishing and seal hunting, was already suited to this exact climate. This was never just a weather problem. It was proof that those who adapt survive, and those who cling to the old ways disappear. By the late 1400s, the Norse colonies of Greenland were completely gone. An entire European population, wiped out because they never learned to change. That is a lesson that still applies today. Survival was never about being the strongest or the richest. It was about adaptability, the ability to change with your circumstances. That is the core of everything we cover on this channel, and the Little Ice Age is one of history's clearest proofs of it. Let's look at what this did to the economy and to power itself. When crops fail repeatedly, it isn't just a food shortage, the entire economic system buckles. Grain prices soar as supply collapses. The wealthy get by, the poor the most. The gap between rich and poor widened sharply during this period, and many historians tie this directly to a wave of peasant revolts. When people have nothing left to eat, and they watch landowners and kings still living in luxury, anger turns into rebellion. England's Peasants' Revolt of 1381 grew from exactly this pressure. Taxes were the spark, but the fuel was years of failed harvests and brutal weather. When basic needs go unmet, people start questioning the people who rule them. The Little Ice Age didn't just change farming, it changed politics. For the first time on this scale, ordinary people began asking whether their rulers actually cared about them at all. Trade routes shifted too. As the North Atlantic grew more dangerous and the Baltic Sea stayed frozen longer each year, merchants had to find new paths, design tougher ships, and rework their entire trade calendar. The economy of an entire continent was being rebuilt around the weather. And it didn't stop at economics. This era carved itself into art, literature, and folklore. Peter Bruegel's famous 1565 painting, Hunters in the Snow, is a direct window into the harshest stretch of the Little Ice Age, snow-covered land, a cold and heavy silence. Even Shakespeare's plays carry the weight of this weather, because it touched every life of that time. Many historians trace tales like Hansel and Gretel back to this exact era, when starvation forced impossible choices onto desperate families. A climate shift doesn't just change what people eat. It seeps into their fears and their stories, and stays there for centuries. In London, the River Thames froze so completely, so many times during the 1600s and 1700s, that people held entire frost fairs on top of it, markets, food, all set up on solid ice. Standing in London today, it's almost impossible to imagine freezing hard enough to hold a fair. That alone tells you how extreme this era really was. Resources and war are never far apart. When food, land, and water grow scarce, conflict tends to follow. Some historians link the devastating 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648 directly to resource scarcity driven by decades of failed harvests. These wars wore the mask of religion and politics, but underneath, the real driver was the oldest one there is, not having enough food. And this was never only a European story. It's simply best documented there because European record-keeping was strong. China suffered harsh winters and crop failures during this same period, a factor in the decline of the Ming dynasty. Parts of Africa saw their rainfall patterns shift, creating serious challenges for local civilizations. But Europe is where this climate shift transformed society most visibly, and that's why we're focused here today. Here's the part that might surprise you the most. Despite everything it destroyed, the Little Ice Age ultimately made Europe stronger. When people face hardship again and again and learn from it, the next generation comes out tougher. Better farming, better homes, new trade routes, sturdier boats, new crops like potato. All of it emerged from this brutal era, and all of it laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution that followed. When the old ways stop working, people are forced to innovate. That is exactly why, after the Little Ice Age, Europe saw a surge in science and technology that a gentler, easier climate may never have produced. If there is one word to summarize what our ancestors learned from this disaster, it is adaptation. Those who changed with the conditions, new crops, better shelter, new methods, survived, and their descendants are still here. Those who clung to the old ways, like the Norse of Greenland, disappeared completely. That is the lesson they left behind, and it matters just as much today as it did centuries ago. So here's my question for you. If you had lived through the Little Ice Age, do you think you would have adapted like the Dutch, or held on too long like the Vikings of Greenland? Tell me in the comments, adapt or hold on, which one do you think you'd have chosen? Like this video if the frost fairs on a frozen Thames surprised you. And subscribe if you want more stories of how our ancestors survived the impossible. Next time, we go somewhere even colder. Until then, take care of yourself.